Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing the unique impact of rivers and river lore on the Ozarks. If the Ozarks are mountains and plateaus, how much did rivers really mold the region?
The hills and hollows and plateaus are defined in many ways by the waterways that stretch through and around them. And the people here are still affected by the lore and traditions that grew up around the water.
We will get back to the rivers, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first running copy of the book Dark Ozarks, The Spook Bite. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get your own Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
Mark your calendars for State of the Ozarks Fest 23, Saturday, September 16th, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. in historic downtown Hollister, Missouri. Meet Dark Ozarks producers Lisa and Josh. Celebrate the traditional Ozarks with craftsmanship, history, and lore. Experience emerging culture through cosplay, goblins, regional cuisine, fine arts, and medieval combat. And even visit the haunted Ye Old English Inn. Visit stateoftheozarks.net for more information.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past, and yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff we sent you.
So, rivers and the mountains, I guess.
There's the waterways of the Ozarks and the waterways that surround the Ozarks have in so many ways defined the Ozarks, and especially with I would say with the development of infrastructure beginning in the 1880s, it has become easier and easier to overlook those impacts. But that doesn't take away from the fact that those impacts are real. And of course, the thing that started changing everyday people's perception of the importance of the river was first the coming of the railroad, and second, the automobile age with all the development of all the bridges.
That's true, as well as the continued logging in the interior of the Ozarks, which changed the navigability of many of the rivers.
It did. And even in comparatively recent time, and not just the logging, I remember a conversation I had with Don Ballou, who just celebrated his 85th birthday on Saturday. And he grew up in rural Christian County, northern Taney County, southern Christian County, and remembers when Bull Creek and a lot of the other creeks did not have essentially the rock debris in the riverbeds or the creek beds, and that they were clean flowing and deep, and you did not have these massive gravel bars. And he said that happened with the tomato farming, because at 85 he can remember when many of the creeks in the Taney County, Christian County areas were deep and did not have gravel bars. But
I think that happened in a lot of places, and from different things. Logging in some areas, tomato farming, wineries in some areas, even in southern Missouri, even in Newton County, Missouri, as well as other farming operations, etc., that have changed the rivers significantly over time. So now that we think of them purely as recreational waterways, that's not how it was in the beginning.
No, and certainly for early French exploration and for white settlement, the initial, I mean, certainly from 1800 until I would say reasonably into the 1880s, a good 80 years realistically, that navigable waterways were the path into the interior.
They really were, and we're taking, I want to say taken for granted, but that was the assumption of how you traversed this rugged area. You either went around it overland or you went through it, and at least in part by river.
And for people that are like, so what? Culturally, what this was doing was something really interesting. In comparatively short order, it was placing what had previously been far western pioneer wilderness in comparatively immediate proximity to New Orleans.
Very true. Very, very true.
And
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say it also, so it's twofold. On one hand, you had the cross trek of ideas, basically the sharing of ideas from New Orleans to Memphis to St. Louis, etc., into the Ozark Highland interior, and in very surprisingly deep ways. We had of course, a steamboat port was at Forsyth. Steamboat port was at Osceola.
Mm-hmm.
And on your side of the Ozarks, Spring River was navigable.
Oh yeah, definitely. And actually we actually had a town on Spring River that was named Port Royal, which I always find very, why in the world someone decided to name it Port Royal?
Great from
but
the
it ended up being burned during the Civil War, not rebuilt. But
I love that.
I've never found the ultimate story for that, but it just harkens you to the Caribbean and pirates.
Well, and we're going to talk about river pirates as well in this episode, but something that, again, in a couple of episodes back, we talked about how oftentimes when we think of the past, we don't think of people in the the pioneer days, etc., taking vacations, but they did.
Mm-hmm.
But also something that we don't think about is how surprisingly well traveled a certain percentage of the population was. Certainly a number of people, once they, for example, landed or grew up, that they might never leave their county. Mm-hmm. But by the same token, you had a number of people who were traveling extensively, and mm-hmm. and many people, not all, but many people were extremely well read and hungry for news, hungry to read the newspapers, hungry to find out everything that was going on. And it's not unreasonable to think that somebody sailing up the Arkansas River and ultimately up the Spring River might not at some point have sailed to Port Royal.
Oh, very true. And who knows, maybe there was a site through there that somehow reminded them of something they knew from the Caribbean. There's no telling. And I'll keep digging, but I haven't found the story on the naming of it, but I always find that amusing.
Just out of curiosity, whereabouts was it located? Was the town located?
It was not that far, probably 20 miles northwest of me.
Nice.
It's in Jasper County. Yeah.
That is so cool. That is so cool. I'm gonna jump to the other side of the state for a moment, to a location I had the opportunity to visit, and I don't think you and I've talked about this story, so I'll just throw it out there. But it's associated with the Châtillon des Menil mansion
Okay.
in St. Louis, just south of Soulard, and is up on the hill. So before
Mhm.
anybody gets bent out of shape about it not being in the Ozarks, topographically it is. It's up on top of not only a big karst limestone ridge, but it's also on top of a massive cave system. But the incredible history, exquisite mansion, highly recommend you go visit. It's hard to miss because it's right next to the Lint Mansion. So there you go. And the particular story in terms of just riverine connection was that one of the de Menil sons was, from what we can tell, a fantastic scholar and had an unbelievably extensive library and was a regular writer and an academic writer as well. And during the late phases of the 19th century was, I believe, tasked with ultimately, I believe, developing the 1904 World's Fair. I believe it says de Menil. I'll have to double check, but regardless, it was a highly scholarly and academic de Menil who was well invested in the river history and the literary history of St. Louis. Gearing up for these bombastic events, the city of St. Louis hosted Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, and was de Menil and Twain ended up being on the same riverboat in regards to these events on the Mississippi River. And de Menil writes in no uncertain terms how much he disliked Twain.
Does he say why?
I'm not entirely sure that I can repeat some of it, but the short version was essentially that he thought he had a very dislikable personality and he did not like his writing style.
Well, I don't think history bore him out on that one.
But on the upside, if I had to pick somebody's mansion, I'm going with de Menil.
There you go. Although Twain's mansion in Connecticut is very beautiful. So I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures. It's very beautiful. And you mentioning that's a good point, that a lot of what we know about, quote, river culture in this region comes from Mark Twain in his writing. And he was well informed. He was a riverboat captain and navigator in his early years.
Although not a good one.
Not a good one. And but you learn from not doing well as much as doing well. And there is a story that a lot of people would are not familiar with that is river related, and Mark Twain as well, is that at the beginning of the Civil War, he mustered into the Confederate Army in southeastern Missouri and had been in camp about 2 weeks. And they are riding out, and there's a personal account. I forget the fellow's first name. Last name is Greeley, and he was a mail runner, a Confederate mail runner during the war, and it's in his autobiography. And that they have to ford the river on horseback and mules, and they're under packs, and Mark Twain's mount gets spooked and drags him underwater, and Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens almost drowns. And so he at that point decided that war was not for him and deserted. And that's actually when he started kind of turning towards the newspaper career. But we came very close to losing Mark Twain to drowning in a river in the Ozarks. So there you go.
And it's and you're very much right, and since it's so much of the romanticism of river lore in American literature draws pretty much all of its ties to Twain. There are other books, obviously, but no one comes anywhere near as well known.
Yeah, I would agree, particularly river lore, as opposed to the seaboards.
And something to me that is very traceable and very interesting, often overlooked, is again the flow of information, the flow of lore, and what that largely translates to is an introduction of hoodoo into the Ozark interior.
Yes.
And those aspects of conjure, and and we have documentation of that going on in St. Charles. You documented evidence of a conjure at the Kendrick House, so on and so forth. So it's and jumping into the paranormal side of this, it would be very interesting to do some actually statistical analysis. Of course, it's difficult to do hard facts to determine, is it a sentient haunting or is it a conjure, but the possibility that many at times poltergeist activity or various types of hauntings, particularly ones that some people find troublesome, that it seems to affect or react to some people as opposed to others that might not affect at all, that how many of those are actually in the site of a traditional hoodoo conjure.
And that's, that would be very interesting. And there are some indication, there are some signs that over time investigators kind of have come up with certain sites that have patterns that seem to be associated with conjuring versus other kinds of hauntings. A lot of it has to do with the appearance of what you see being slightly different than sort of your normal apparition.
Yeah.
So it would be very interesting, and obviously some of these sites are a little more easily identifiable, where you did have slave populations, because there is a correlation between use of hoodoo and in the slave population, or very early Black communities. And there are obviously other places that would have conjurings and hoodoo activity that might not be as obvious, and so those are the ones that be a little harder to pin down.
They would. They would. And to me, it really speaks to the fact that there's so many people who've gone on before us that their stories and their experiences and what they left behind have been forgotten.
Yeah.
And it's, something, a situation as simple as a crossroads, a highway, a parking lot, a subdivision that we would go by at 60 miles an hour and not give it a second thought, but something may have happened there, or someone may have impacted the energy of that spot in a cross-generational way, and possibly even an interdimensional way. And until someone trips it, essentially, you have no way of knowing that it was there.
That's very, very true. And then often people have a hard time of figuring out what they have tripped.
Yes. Yes. And going off on a bit of a soapbox, but there's there's so much superficial information about the paranormal,
Mm-hmm.
but oftentimes it even amongst commentary, and it remains superficial. So there isn't the desire to do a deep dig and say, okay, we think it might be this, and it's this quote unquote maybe the monster of the week. But what if it isn't? What if it is
Right.
something else? What if it is something that comes from a much older tradition? What if
Well,
it?
yeah, and things tend to seem to get molded into a homogenous monster of the week. We were kind of talking about that earlier, that the way people are properly talking about certain entities and phenomena tends to ultimately, if it's of the spooky, scary variety at all, ultimately seems to get warped and packaged into the vanilla flavored demon of the week description, and they'll probably upset some people, but it's very true. You see that a lot on online, in social media, even on a lot of movies and TV shows, and so that all of these creatures or entities from different parts of the country and cultures end up being described exactly the same way.
They do, and there's fascinating elements. First of all, the word demon has a lot of different connotations depending on the cultures that you're dealing with, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We're inured within a strongly Christian substrate in North America, so it stands to reason that our minds immediately go to that as a historical or a contextualization when we encounter, potentially malevolent pushback and horror. That, but one word like demon does not effectively contextualize things for a vast compendium of experiences. And I will also go out on a weird limb, since I don't have any notes on this subject. So I'm just going to say what I think, and what I think I don't know. So here we go. I've had my coffee tonight. There's two approaches in terms of supernatural or paranormal encounters. And one, of course, is that the paranormal encounters are all basically one of maybe 1 to 2 dozen types that lots and lots of different peoples from around the world have all experienced essentially the same things, not the same thing, but the same things. And based on regional cultures, those cultures created different translations for what they're experiencing. And I think that is potentially valid. We do see, I'm not throwing that out. We do see, for example, examples of Fey interaction that have a lot of similarities, whether it's the Cherokee talking about the little people or it's the Irish talking about the Fey. So that has merit,
at least in certain contexts. Yes, I agree with you.
Certain context. I will also interject the possibility that certain paranormal phenomena might be specific to a culture. or specific to a region in which that culture inhabits.
I agree.
That that some things, so for example, some quote unquote, I'm just going to spitball here, but the idea that certain aspects of, for example, Japanese water demon lore, we could be talking about first of all, the manifestation of an entity that has nothing to do with, say, demon lore of Roman Catholicism,
Right.
even though the names are getting translated as the same word, but also that it may be a manifestation that is specific to a very narrow region, maybe associated with a very, very specific, for example, type of conjure, either purposeful or inadvertent, and maybe dealing with something that you're not going to encounter anywhere else.
I think that that's sort of my experience and my observations as well. So
And it's so of course, what I'm basically proposing is two opposing ideas and saying the answer is both simultaneously, just to muddy the waters, to make a Missouri River reference. But I think there's some real thought-provoking aspects of that. And then for example, when you look at hoodoo and you look at where hoodoo comes from, and of course voodoo is a more direct line, and you're essentially, and you deal heavily with water spirits, as well as other elemental spirits, and the Loa, the cosmology of the Loa. I think that is a really good example, and my tie-in to rivers is, of course, the transfer of these conjures and these belief systems were done via the water, which is both tragic and poetic and beautiful all at the same time. That I suspect, I can't speak for the people themselves, but I would conjecture that the many Loa who are communicated with and tasked with and given offerings to, certainly the cosmology of voodoo, and by consequence the shared similarities of cosmology with aspects of hoodoo, would argue that those are from West Africa, that those are specific personalities and sentiences, and they're not going to be found in Europe innately, although a practitioner could go to those locations and continue the practice, but you wouldn't go there to find them. You would have to take the practice with you and connect with them there. So there is almost an interdimensional ancestral lands that tie things to certain locations, and we seem to see some aspect of that with, for example, the Cherokee or the Quapaw
being brought west with them.
Yes.
No, I agree with you there.
Or the Irish Fae being brought with Scots Irish.
So, all of these factors do affect the lore and experiences here. And the rivers had a lot to do with it, particularly, I think, with hoodoo and conjuring, because so much of that culture really either traversed the rivers to get here or settled along the rivers, be it the Missouri, Little Dead Sea, or the Arkansas River and southern portions of the Ozarks along the Mississippi, down towards the Delta in Arkansas.
And that's before you even get to the swamps. And the Ozarks do have swamps. I mean, as you get into
Yes,
moving down,
very,
uh,
very, very, very true. I just had images of swamp monsters.
we could jump into talking about the White River monster.
Okay.
To me, I'll throw out my 2 cents worth, but to me, I'm always consternated in terms of how I feel about the White River monster. It's in part, so it's for people who are not familiar in the lower regions of the White River in Arkansas. Twice during the 20th century, there was considerable hubbub about the sighting of the White River monster, and the sighting tended to vary rather extensively, but the basic gist was it was something very, very large in the White River, and large meant scary, which is understandable. And then photographers, hunting parties, expeditions, etc., were formed in both cases and didn't turn anything up conclusive. That's the short version. What is fascinating to me is really being able to parse out, first of all, no offense against the folks, but if it was just a publicity stunt, if it was just something to try to gain some attention for the heck of it. But second, if it wasn't, then running through the usual list of suspects of what it might have been.
Right, and the one that seems to come up the most would be a northern elephant seal, which are in the Gulf of Mexico and do come up to Mississippi. They've been found as far north as Ohio,
which is challenging in terms of expectation.
Determined, I would say.
Yeah. And that and maybe a little more on the mundane, just the possibility that it's a really big catfish.
Yeah, it'd have to be a really big one, but I mean, it's entirely possible.
It's the aspects of the sighting. Of course, there was a sighting in July of 1937. And then there was another sightings in June and July of 1971. So, some of the reports said that it looked like a large sturgeon or a catfish. In some cases, it was the size of a boxcar. It looked as if the thing was peeling all over, but it had a smooth type of skin. One said that the animal had a bone protruding from its forehead. Strange noises were attributed to the creature. Sounded like the combination of a cow's moo and a horse's neigh. And as you noted, that some researchers believe that it may have been a large male elephant seal that had come up the Mississippi.
Right, and they are known to make similar noises as to what was observed, and I think the most interesting aspect from a lore perspective is that there are places where unusual things are seen, and they may just be an animal out of place, like a seal. It may be something that is just very isolated to a particular area, which doesn't seem to be real likely, or there would be more sightings. I would be interested to know if there was something particularly similar, like with weather patterns, etc. Those years, 71 and 37, that might have caused animals to migrate differently than normal or something.
It's very fascinating. I mean, and there's also the original documented sighting was in 1915.
Oh, that's right. There was earlier.
So 1915, 1937, and 1971. So it's
So we're overdue for a sighting.
we are, and it's Jackson County, Arkansas, and specifically around Newport.
Mm-hmm.
The rivers, rivers are beautiful. Rivers, if you take a moment and begin to contemplate them in introspection, particularly our rivers in the larger ones, can be a bit unsettling. And had a really interesting experience. We'll document further, and it wasn't a paranormal experience, although there is a lot of energy. I got to go to Fort Bellefontaine the last time I was in the St. Louis area, and it's fascinating space to begin with. Weirdly isolated, and a lot of the structure is comparatively recent, 1930s, 1940s. Building these lavish tiered stoneworks overlooking the Missouri River. And there is hauntings associated with it. Lady on the Stairs and a rust red apparitional phantom mist that tends to move about and that sort of thing. I didn't see any of that. I will say that the space at sunset has a very odd energy. I will say that. It a little unsettling, kind of makes you want to watch your back. Certainly a sense of watchfulness. But I got down to the several flights of grand stone staircases down to the actual overlook of the Missouri River. It's incredibly impressive because even at that point, you walk up on a sand bluff and it's still another 20 feet drop down to the river. But I was getting closer and I was taking photos. I kept hearing what sounded like people splashing in the water, but no voices, just splashing. And sporadically, but enough that it was noticeable, and it kept kind of unsettling me. I'm like, I'm just going to walk down and see what I see. And what it finally appeared to be was that the large invasive Asian carp that have infested the Missouri and working their way up the Mississippi and working their way up the other rivers. So these, comparatively speaking, these drastically large fish were flinging themselves out of the water at random points and then splashing back into the river. But just standing there and looking out over the space and the massiveness of the Missouri River at that point at dusk. And you look out across the water, and that water could hide a lot of things, and you'd never know.
Oh, definitely. They hide a lot of secrets. Well, and there's a a tale of a Missouri River monster as well. At various points of the river, over hundreds of miles. So I think there are so many waterways have these tales. Not all, but many. And I think in part we have a primal connection to waterways that goes back much further than even the settling of this area, but goes back thousands of years. And you see it in mythology and lore around the world, that connection, and that there is a liminal space, there is a tendency for unknown monsters to inhabit that space.
It's very, for individuals who really see themselves as so modern and sophisticated that monsters can exist, liminal spaces can exist, a very literal translation of the world around us. It does us as humanity good to sit in these grand environments, and choose to be introspective. And it can be very uncomfortable if you're in the wrong headspace, because it's extraordinarily humbling.
Yes, it really is. But I think it does something. It's very grounding as well to do so.
It is, and that reminds me. I know we're just jumping into all sorts of topics, but it does really remind me a little bit of my bridge experience in Boonville.
Actually, that came to mind earlier when you were talking.
I do have to admit the Missouri River has had an odd impact on me at various times, and certainly for me the Missouri River is always going to be the northern moat of the Ozarks.
Mm-hmm.
When you cross the Missouri, you've officially crossed into the Ozarks, and again, my Buttery Sprite experience is with the side of the Missouri River, and then the Boonville experience. It's the for people who don't know, it's the old railroad bridge at Boonville, and it's no longer a functional railroad bridge, and there's a walking trail that leads up to the bridge, and then you can walk out a portion over the railroad tracks and then a bit over the river. And I just had such an incredibly unsettling experience, one that I was not anticipating. The bridge is so large, there's no reason that you would find yourself falling off of it. I mean, it's vast. It's and getting up on there. And the funny thing is, it wasn't the height, because it's as tall over the railroad portion as it is over the later portion. And I was meandered up there with my phone camera and my iPhone, and taking photos and getting pictures of the railroad track. And sun was also setting. Interesting comparison, but with Bellefontaine. But just enjoying myself immensely, and not remotely thinking, oh my gosh, this is so creepy. Why am I so unsettled? And then I wander out into the further out, and I'm now over the Mississippi River. And, I'm also the guy who, as a kid, couldn't wait to go across the Mississippi River at Burlington and at Fort Madison, because both bridges were magnificent. And as a little 4-year-old, I wanted to peek out the window so I could see through the grates to the Mississippi River, a vast distance down, so on and so forth. So there's no reason why just standing on a big paved platform that is now over the water is something that I should find unsettling. But I did, and it hit like that. I was out over there, and I'm going, all of a sudden, the first thing that I experienced, which is also unreasonable, the first thing I experienced was, oh my gosh, I'm going to drop my phone over the edge. I'm not even near the edge. It's this irrational sense of hang on to your phone really tight. You can't let it fall. You can't let it, and go, okay, if you got to get pictures, get your pictures, and then just get off this space. Just, and I'm also the weird guy that doesn't, I photographed Round Spring, which is very tall. And Dale was with me. We were meandering around getting photos for State of the Ozarks. And Dale's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, here's the deal. As long as I'm looking through the camera lens, I can't get hurt. So I'm just gonna like lean over the side of the spring.
Because that's how physics works.
Exactly. That's how physics works. I'll just, sort of, hook my feet around some trees and get my shot. And all of a sudden, on this perfectly safe bridge in Boonville, Missouri, I'm like, I can't stand this. I have to get off of here. And
maybe an indication of something that's happened there in the past. I don't know.
If I were to speculate, I'd be very interested to know of any, accidents or occurrences, or any incidences that took place, because I honestly felt like I was feeling somebody else's feelings.
And you may have been.
It was, it was very unsettling. And interestingly enough, as soon as I was back over the railroad portion, that was done.
You may have just walked through someone else's moment.
It's quite possible, and I think to me the water aspect is significant, because to me the water itself represents almost a conjure in and of itself. It is a living liminal space.
It always is for me. Moving water is for me as well.
Now, I'm curious that there's jumping over into paranormal and folklore.
Okay.
In regards to water, we have really long-standing folklore that spirits can't cross water. That, for example, Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Right.
You just make it across the bridge, the headless horseman cannot follow you. From a on-the-ground investigation standpoint, we see what appears to be apparition, sentient spirit following water, moving where being able to almost use the water as a conduit to transition from one location to another. And for example, a haunting that if you didn't know where the water ran, the underground, it would seem really random. But once you put it together, that where the water runs, these seemingly random but identical apparition incidences taking place, the commonality is following the water. So we have certain situations where spirit seems to be following water. You have other situations or folklore that says, oh, spirits can't cross water. Of course, jumping suddenly into Eastern Europe, the tradition of Berkta, the winter witch, a springtime tradition is to. We didn't get to this. It was in the back of my head the last time we were talking about witch dunkings, but I never got there. But it's related to water.
As we do.
Yes. It's a weekly conversation. Tune in next week for Witchpath, and but the winter witch Berkta. There's a strong essentially southeastern European tradition that at the herald of springtime, the effigy of Berkta will be thrown into the river and washed away.
And my experience investigating and so forth tells me that, spirit, certainly water is not a barrier. It's not something that they can't traverse or even travel. But there is a lot of folklore associated with that notion, which to me has always been interesting, since we also have a very long-standing tradition of lore that spirit travels across water on journey from life to death. So,
Yes.
and that's in Greek mythology, that's in Egyptian mythology, Sumerian lore, going back really as far as written accounts and oral tradition holds that traveling or crossing water is very important for spirit. So, and perhaps it's just that Chinese wall we build around ourselves. We tell ourselves we're okay. And who knows? We joked earlier about moats. Maybe over time, as moats and waterways were used as defensive fortifications, that other notion grew up. I don't know. I kind of wonder where it did grow up.
Well, and jumping into the hobgoblin tradition of the Anglo-Saxons, which did get brought over and certainly is associated as well with North American swamps, not only the concept of the will-o'-the-wisp, but the concept that coming back to the water, but in this case stagnant waters, the spirits will lead you astray in the swamps.
That's true. That's true.
Is especially haunting to me. Here's an interesting 3 for nothing that I was going to text, but we're on here, so I'm just going with it. But again, I'm obsessing over Berkta, and I think it's the fact that we're passing into beginning almost to reach into autumn, and of course, the darkest time of year is Yule after autumn, but. We was just sharing a bit of the online lore about the singing lakes recorded in Yellowstone National Park, and the humming, the singing, the sounds. But one of the accounts mentions that it sounds like humming bees. It sounds like bees buzzing, and that was incredibly interesting to me, because the Legends of the Winter Witch, which is an alpine. Is alpine lore, in particularly around Austria, is that the Winter Witch is heralded by the sound of bees in winter.
And that is interesting. That's true. I hadn't thought about that, but the story about Yellowstone Lake, it's interesting because the activity happens year round, basically, and can't be explained. And I think that there are places in the Ozarks where you have similar kinds of things going on, and one of them is actually on our list, and that would be Dexter Harding's Sawdust Bridge. It has some very similar characteristics to that.
It does, and this is an Arkansas story.
It is.
It's an Arkansas borderland story. The lore and the noir history surrounding it is so significant that it's well worth including as a Borderlands tale.
I think so. Plus, it also is very demonstrable of what we were saying about some of this lore, river lore, being brought in with groups coming in, and so what happens there, I think, can be revealing for events in other areas in the region too. But it's basically near Pine Bluff, and there's a tributary of the river there that ended up being almost landlocked, and sawmill built, Dexter Harding's sawmill, in fact. And basically it ended up kind of dividing town in half, and there wasn't a bridge, and they ingenuity at its finest, but they used sawdust to create a bridge. And so, can't say that it's probably the bridge I'd want to use, but
you use what you got.
Use what you got. And it would become so dangerous, and people would be fearful of using it at times, and then they started seeing things on the bridge and apparitions and so forth. And the local Black population, this is in the mid 1800s, they started telling tales of it being haunted. And again, though, the spirits would have been surrounded by the water. So
yes. Now, were the apparitions being attributed to individuals, for example, that have been killed and then basically thrown into the swampish areas?
Well, and that's the thing is that that was what made it even spookier, was because they couldn't necessarily attribute them to any particular deaths, but that these the Haints would be seen and heard, and to the point that people were too scared to use the bridge. And eventually the entire mill pond or lake, it was more like a small lake, was filled in, and where the bridge is now part of one of the city streets. And that basically that the tales of the hauntings went on for quite a long time afterwards, but that they've slowly faded away.
Interesting. So from an investigation standpoint, where would you start with something like this?
Well, I saw a documentary video that, if I may be misspeaking, but if I remember right, it was done by Arkansas PBS, that had interviews of people in the area talking about the stories that have been handed down through generations about it. And certainly starting there, but probably going to that site. I mean, it's as you were talking earlier, you can go by places and not know what was there. This is one of those. It's now a regular street with stores and so forth, and no one would have any idea of what had been there 200 years ago. But that certainly, it'd be interesting to check out that area to see if the merchants in the buildings were, had an unusual amount of activity or anything like that, to see if anything had lingered.
It would. Now, I don't know, we've discussed this on a number of the tours and investigations that we've done. I'm contemplating because the knee-jerk response to a haunting is that something bad had to have happened in that location for the haunting to occur.
Right.
That is the superficial or the cursory approach. And so if you're, and there's a little bit of logic misstep, so that, if you do not have any documented lore about a haunting, then the first conclusion is nothing bad happened in that location.
Right.
which in some cases could be categorically untrue.
Mm-hmm.
And the flip side to that is that if there is a haunting, then something bad must have happened.
Right.
Which investigation often suggests a contradiction to that.
Correct.
That hauntings can occur. And haunting, of course, is a broad term. I'm using the term as just manifestation of what appears to be paranormal occurrence. That hauntings can take place when nothing bad necessarily happened, or certainly you can't document that anything bad happened there, or that if it does appear to be a sentient haunting, it might be a haunting that doesn't have any strongly negative connotation to it.
True.
An individual who passed but didn't pass tragically, didn't pass with any particular unresolved business, did not pass somehow tethered to the location, unable to escape, but for whatever reason chose to remain, potentially for a time. And some of those hauntings can be very benign, not only benign, but actually very positive. But it's a choosing to stay out of appreciation or love for a space, just like certain spaces we love immensely, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if, for example, the rather gargantuan task of maneuvering that much sawdust and creating something somehow was not an inadvertent conjure, or something that drew someone from someplace else for an unknown reason.
Well, it certainly does make you wonder. I mean, it grew to the point that that there was no obvious origin story to the hauntings, but the people around, and it wasn't just the Black community who were telling them that believed this. It affected the stories affected the townspeople enough that they got to where they wouldn't cross the lake. And it kind of almost divided the town in two for a time period until they literally filled in the lake and paved it over.
It is. I love the quote. Men and beasts dreaded to cross the spongy surface, especially at night, because of the strange lights, weird sounds, blasts of hot air, snakes, and alligators.
The alligators would definitely do it for me.
It agreed. And of course the reports of Haints. And for people who may not be familiar with the Ozarks, Haints mean ghosts.
Yep. So it's just sort of a fascinating story of activity centered in water, and it's hard to parse out the relationship between the two, but it certainly seems to be intertwined one way or another.
It does. It does. It really does. And I'd like to do some investigation down that way.
Me too. I think it'd be interesting.
A lot of fun. Jumping over to steamboats.
Okay.
Jumping over steamboats. We've got a number of we've got a lot. I mean the it's not borderlands, the Mississippi River as it immediately borders and in some cases crosses through topographically or geologically the Ozarks, essentially between Cairo and St. Louis, was originally a graveyard of boats.
Yes.
There's well over 100 steamboat wrecks that occurred for a variety of reasons. And the steamboat traffic was not safe pretty much anywhere. It was very new technology that was being replicated with abandon.
Very, very, and yeah, just churned out as quickly as possible. And I think even nationwide, the average lifespan of a riverboat was less than 3 years on average.
Yeah. It's
Which also said how much money they made off of them in a short time.
Yes, it's difficult to fathom. I mean, in terms of how much money was being made, how much commercial profit was occurring, how much commerce was being transitioned, and it really speaks to certainly the extraordinary industrialism but also personal industry of these individuals who were presented with the possibility that in some cases it was a lie, but in many cases it was truth, that if you worked unbelievably hard and took risk in this newfound frontier pioneer industry that is now the middle of America, that you could go from, it was a very upwardly mobile strata, that you could go from someone with nothing to someone with comparatively extraordinary wealth in 10, 15 years. In some cases,
some cases less.
yeah, some cases a lot less. Please see the Olivia and Mr. Bindalari.
Yep.
And that's, it created I think a cultural foment that is very difficult for us to wrap our heads around today. In the development, and we really, the United States really hasn't seen anything quite like it since that sort of explosion of industry combined with extraordinary raw materials. Because that's what it was. We had the comparatively unheard of modern transportation and modern technology of moving things and getting things to other markets, and at the same time we were wholesale appreciating and plundering the inland interior with extraordinary forests and mineral deposits and farmland. Fortunately, farmland's still there. So it's hard to really wrap your head around that. But I think that's one of the reasons that there was such a spirit of great reward with great risk.
And a lot of people willing to take that risk.
And some of it out of desperation. There was not certainly not the safety nets that we have today, comparatively speaking.
Not at all. And the potential upside was so high and significant that the risk of losing didn't necessarily change where you started from a whole lot to begin with.
It did. And in the upheaval of the Civil War, I think on one hand destroyed, obviously, the death toll was catastrophic, but it destroyed a lot of people's fortunes, but it also paved the way for all of these other fortunes to be made. It's incredible transfer of wealth. A quote, I'll find the provenance of the source citation and quote here. River traffic revived after the Civil War by John Q. Wolfe, originally published in the Batesville Daily Guard of January 18th, 1941. It's on page 12 of our notes, and the paragraph reads, when the war ended, the upper river country was in ruins, and the upper river country in question is specifically the Ozarks.
Right.
The pioneers who had ventured into that wilderness, cleared the land, built homes, and established law and order had been ruined. Many had been killed, and all had lost practically everything they owned except their farms. Such flourishing towns as Athens, Mount Olive, Sycamore, Calico Rock, and North Fork were all but deserted. Farms had grown up in briars and sprout. There was no money in the country to buy things so badly needed. Hence, there was no inducement for the boats to resume their trade.
Mm-hmm. So it had a direct impact. And that might be, we might just mentioning that the effect of the war, talk about Osceola just briefly.
Definitely. I mean, it's and that whole region, and we're I would conjecture that to the uninitiated, the region around Osceola in those spaces, and we're talking Osceola, Clinton, Humansville, on up, stretching a bit closer toward Independence. This space is almost what I would classify as the overlooked Ozarks.
Yes, and down towards Stockton and over to Bolivar, that general area. You don't hear as much lore about it or, history, but there's an awful lot there. And Osceola really almost probably was the Queen City of the Ozarks.
If I think it is fair to conjecture that without the Civil War, Osceola instead of Springfield would have been the big town.
Yes.
I find it conceptually fascinating because Springfield would not have existed as it did had the railroad not been built.
Right.
And that I think if you were up and coming industrious sort in the 1850s, you absolutely would have been putting your money on Osceola as you were projecting what Missouri would have become. And to have, if you could have gotten in a time machine and flash forward to 1950 and walked out to what Osceola was in 1950, what the Osage River was in 1950 after the development of the Bagnell Dam, I think in 28, but don't quote me on that, and then compare it to the comparative metropolis of Springfield in the 1950s. Depending on who you were, it could have been exciting or surprising or unbelievably disheartening.
Yes. And it's a tale that it has some twists in it that basically Osceola got the brunt of retribution for something that didn't even happen in Missouri because it was prosperous.
Yes.
and basically you have Humboldt, Kansas to is where it all starts, is that well, and it starts before that, but we can pin it on Humboldt, that Confederate forces, Confederate partisan forces under John Matthews raided Humboldt, Kansas, and actually a couple of times, basically burnt the town. And as a consequence, Jim Lane, who ultimately crosses paths with Quantrell in Lawrence, Kansas, decides as retaliation to march on Osceola and loot it, because it was known to have a lot of money in the banks and a lot of wealthy people. It was a major river port in central Ozarks. And so basically Osceola is minding its own business, and something that happened, 100 miles away in Kansas, they end up with Lane and his Union forces marching on them in basically the summer of 1861.
Yes, which is again extraordinarily early.
Yes, very early. So I think we're actually looking at what, September of 1861, if I remember right.
Yeah. And you think about this, Battle of Carthage was just around July 4th of 1861. First Battle of Bull Run at the end of July in 1861. And then Battle of Wilson's Creek in August.
Yeah, early August. And so this is a little over a month later.
And an enormous amount of upheaval, of question, of troop movements, of course, everything that happened in St. Louis, essentially in May, which is only 1 month after Sumter.
Right.
The compression of events. We oftentimes think of things happening like it took a long time for people to get the word, or it took a long time for people to, the compression of events, of the intensity, the conflagration of war in 1861 in the Ozarks, in Missouri, is extraordinary. And
it really is.
And of course, I think something that likely precipitated, that basically primed the pump was Bloody Kansas, which I still find interesting, because the opportunism, and this of course gets into very delicate cultural issues, but the opportunism that was taking place with the rapid abolitionist settlement of Kansas was certainly in some parts fueled by very noble abolitionist efforts, and were fueled in other parts by a desire to take advantage of noble abolitionist efforts, or to use them as a front to, in some cases, wage war, and in some cases to plunder. And Lane is Jim Lane, who was very much an opportunist, originally from Indiana, and is documentably on whatever side he thought was going to get him what he wanted.
Yeah.
Chose to become a firebrand abolitionist for very opportunistic and financially opportunistic reasons, and gets himself appointed in charge of this army.
Yes, and of course, as time goes on, his personality starts causing problems, and he loses influence. But early on, he's in charge of this army in Kansas, and this is also dealings with Lane, or were also things that pushed, say, Joe Shelby squarely into the Confederate camp after, and so Lane had a lot of effect in the Ozarks, even though he technically was based in Kansas. And I mean, and just his actions at Osceola, I think, are pretty indicative of showing that he was opportunistic and out for plunder, down to, stealing a woman's piano for his wife and things like that.
And I think that's one of the things that makes the burning of Osceola so not uniquely tragic to the war, but certainly tragic to the Ozarks and Missouri Ozarks, is that indicators are that Osceola was predominantly targeted for its wealth.
Yes.
Not for strategic reasons, but for the fact that it was the equivalent of a rich seaport.
It was kind of like raiding Port Royal.
Yeah. And they did. And then they burned it pretty much to the ground.
Yes.
And I think it's a testament to Osceola that actually did survive. I mean, many towns under the same circumstances. Sherwood, a great example of the fact not there anymore. Osceola is there, but in a very diminished state from what its projections were.
Right, and actually, the population now is not that much different than it was in 1861. So, but basically, this is the event that then, with the war raging, it no longer was being used as a commercial port the way it had been. Right. And then the war itself kind of then moved commerce and supply trains from the rivers to the Indian trails, ultimately between Rolla and Springfield. And so as a result, Springfield became more a base of operations, even more so than it had been. And so these are events that directly impacted the progress of the region.
They did. And coming back to sort of the river impact region, but then the region itself, something I think, well, there's several. One is that the burning of Osceola embedded itself in I would say, the ancestral consciousness. But it has survived. The imagery of the burning of Osceola has survived in a romantically corrupted form.
Yeah.
And specifically through a George Kiefer painting, and specifically through Fire in the Hole in Silver Dollar City. And I was just discussing a bit of this history here last week with some folks who mentioned the fact that they were talking about asking, didn't the Bald Numbers burn Osceola? And no, they didn't. That was, again, painting with a broad brush, but basically a rogue Union army.
Yeah.
And in that situation, you see a conflation of events. You see a conflation of the vigilante Bald Knobbers, but then you see a conflation of the Taney County Bald Knobbers with the Christian County Bald Knobbers, because the Bald Knobbers now are almost consistently represented wearing the masks of Christian County Bald Knobbers, not of Taney County Bald Knobbers.
Right.
But then you have this sort of regional ancestral memory that the Bald Knobbers burned a town.
Which they didn't.
No, they did not.
However, we there is an argument to be made that the burning of Osceola, had it not happened, we would not have the legends of Jesse James either. So
Correct.
because basically ultimately as retribution for Osceola, you can draw a direct line between that and the burning of Lawrence, and then the vilification of Quantrell and his men, including the James brothers, leading to, I think, a very valid argument that their outlaw days were really a direct result of that version of events and not being able to go home, so to speak. So, a lot of different things can be traced to Jim Lane deciding to burn Osceola.
It can be, and and we see this a number of times, that conflict in the Ozarks becomes pivotal to these much larger narratives.
Yeah, it really does, and a lot of lines connecting these different events that seem very disparate on the surface.
They do, and with that, just as a paranormal point, and I find this fascinating and also tragic in the what I'm loosely referring to as the overlooked Ozarks. And overlooked because it is an area, a region. Again, we're talking Osceola, Clinton, Stockton, Warsaw, throughout this space, is that in many cases, because it's a transitional space, it's a liminal space in and of itself, but it's a transitional space from an actually higher altitude, a raised, but it's tall grass prairie, or was originally tall grass prairie, from northern Missouri and Kansas coming across, and then the erosion begins to expose some of that karst limestone, which is, of course, classic Ozarks raised upland plateau. And so when you're in it, if you don't know what you're looking for, you could very easily mistake it for more traditional Midwestern tall grass prairie, or former tall grass prairie, now cropland, that just happens to occasionally have some funky limestone outcroppings and that sort of thing, without realizing that it is part of the Ozarks. And it doesn't, oftentimes, just in terms of sort of the larger narrative lore, you don't have the really evocative, traditional, rugged mountain landscapes like you have in the Boston Mountains, down in Arkansas, or some of the very rugged regions over, in Shannon County, et cetera, along Current and 11 Point, that sort of thing. And then culturally, it tends to be in the shadow of the Kansas City metro.
It can be, yeah. That and Springfield.
In that sense. So it's comparatively easy to overlook. It is very rural at this point. And populations, county populations tend to be quite low. But this was an area with an enormous amount of Civil War conflict. And to add to the tragedy to that, it was Civil War conflict that also got overlooked, because these were very small skirmishes that were raging throughout the space, but you didn't have the benefit of the chroniclers and the newspapers and the epic history that you see with Manassas and Chickamauga and these and Vicksburg and these big moments. So you had individuals, you had soldiers, you had, obviously had bushwhackers, you had Union soldiers, you had Confederate soldiers, Missouri Partisan Guard, and civilians all fighting and dying, and then basically being forgotten,
Mhm.
and often never documented. And
Or at least not well.
increasingly, I have come across multiple reports. One of my closer contacts, who grew up in the area, going, oh, and then there was the Civil War soldier who lived in my house, but he was
Mhm.
dead. And and oh, I was camping, and the apparition of two soldiers walked out of the woods. Well, I was there. Or I was in somebody's house near the lake, and there was, a dead guy in Civil War, Civil War era clothing, who
Mhm.
just stood in the kitchen.
And there are a lot of those kind of stories in this part of the Ozarks.
It's, to me, it's heartbreaking, but I think it's also just unbelievably fascinating. And I'm glad the hauntings remain, because at least with the reminder, it's still a testimony to the violence that took place and the heartbreak that occurred.
Very much so. Very, very much so.
Jumping down to an Arkansas river,
Okay.
which is War Eagle, page 9 on the first document of our two documents with it notes.
Okay.
War Eagle Mill, and of course next month or middle of October is War Eagle Craft Fair, which is incredible and claustrophobic and exciting and extraordinary. But the mill itself is home to a lot of interesting lore. For example, and this is not dissimilar to what I was talking about in the Humansville area of Missouri. Confederate soldier has been seen walking the shores of the river. The Confederates burned the original mill in 1862. It's, one bit of speculation is that there's a spirit of a soldier who scavenged the area and then possibly was killed. A poltergeist is said to haunt the restaurant, and the mill itself has been built 3 times.
Yeah.
Lost once in the war, lost again just to a fire, and then we have the current mill built in 1973, but it's built to the specifications of the second mill,
Mhm.
which is beautiful, and the cornbread and beans are excellent. There's a couple of the hauntings associated, and I share this because it is directly related to the river.
Uh-huh.
The mill is obviously on the river for the obvious reasons that it's a water mill. The original builder, Sylvanus Blackburn, is said to inhabit the mill as a poltergeist, and the Riverside soldier, the apparition of the soldier is said to be, quote, a young, sad-looking man who stares into the water.
That's kind of interesting. Made you wonder why he's staring in the water, what exactly transpired.
Mm-hmm. It's, again, I think it's incredibly introspective and more sad than frightening.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there.
The on jumping across the state, we do have, of course, a rather dramatic riverboat disaster from the war.
Yes.
And it's very much Ozarks borderlands, because we're dealing with the river space, the Mississippi River. north
Mhm.
of, uh, and it's specifically the Sultana. We've got two significant riverboat incidents on the borders of the Ozarks, down on the Mississippi with the Sultana, and of course up on the Missouri with the Arabia.
Yes. Um, um, and the Sultana, isn't it the most deaths on the Mississippi
In one place,
in one place?
I'm pretty sure it is. It was the destruction of the Sultana. Spoiler alert: the ship blew up. So,
Hmm.
break that. The boat blew up, and it it coincided with the end of the war and the assassination of Lincoln, and it's really just phenomenally tragic because we have the equivalent of a battlefield's worth of deaths, and it largely gets overlooked because technically the war was basically over.
Yeah, I mean, it basically was full of soldiers being taken home
and
after the
and
war.
to have survived the war.
And some of them have been actually released from a prisoner of war camp, if I remember right.
Yes, and then to be killed in an unbelievably tragic and avoidable disaster is absolutely heartbreaking. Um, Jumping to the paranormal side, obviously we know that of the destruction of the Sultana, and we'll get into some of the details of that here in just a moment. What are your thoughts on uh, paranormal occurrences from that disaster? I mean, it's just kind of out in the river.
Yeah. And I don't have any specific accounts that are tied to that, but there are accounts along the Mississippi and other rivers of people seeing um, images of people uh, coming out of the water, like they are, bedraggled and have been through heck, and or floating on debris or things like that. I don't have any particular ones of the Sultana, but I would be kind of surprised if there isn't something that happens at some point,
Mhm.
just because of the amount of energy involved, the number of people involved, how the sudden violence of the incident. Those kind of incidents tend to leave an impression in the environment that um, gets replayed.
They do, and I think again as a what a theme that I feel like we keep coming back to is um, hauntings and occurrences that resonate within spaces in which not a lot of people are in today.
Right. I mean, if you aren't on the water or along the shore where that happens, you you wouldn't encounter it, and very few people are. It's similar to, and we're not at liberty to talk about it yet, but the train crash uh, um, incident that we're in the process of trying to investigate, where people see apparitions of people walking down the railroad into the river and out the other side. basically walking the direction that they would have been going. And it's not seen a lot because it's all on private property, but people who live in the area still see it occasionally, even though this happened a very long time ago. And I think it's the same thing. The old saying about if a tree falls in the forest, no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a noise. Well,
Yes.
if no one's there to see it, is it still a haunting? I think it's debatable. I think you can make arguments both ways but to me, activity does happen at times, whether there's an observer or not.
I agree. I think that there's an interesting duality to this, because on one aspect, our involvement or our interest or our bringing energy into the space can amplify paranormal occurrences. And sometimes in very obvious ways, sometimes in much less obvious ways. From, and I would say the gamut tends to be, at the most provocational end of, again, of attempting to provoke entities for a reaction,
right.
Ranging down to inadvertent thought forms, the idea of and the accidental projection of energy, and imbuing a space with energy that perhaps attracts spirit or amplifies an existing resonance. But I think a number of sentient hauntings would argue that they're going to be there whether we are or not. And
exactly. Which, I mean, considering that things are caught on surveillance cameras when no one's around, kind of points that direction.
It does. And I think the great existential argument of the 20th century, if human beings, as we understand human beings, aren't there to observe, then perhaps it doesn't even exist, is extraordinarily arrogant.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think it just gets more complicated for people when they think, well, if these are human entities or human consciousnesses, then it takes a human to encounter it. Well, that's not the case in everyday life anyway. So
no, and I really think that the vast bulk of postmodern philosophy and Freudian existentialism could have been solved by some very simple conversations with some traditional shaman tradition practitioners who could have just set folks down and said, "You're wrong." The world is much greater, much grander, much more complex, has a much more magnificent cosmology, and you're both, invited to be a beautiful part of it. But if you keep up that ridiculous train of thought, you're going to find yourself utterly insignificant within it. And sooner or later, this cosmology in its infinite arrays is going to prove to you just how insignificant we are.
some might argue that it has. So.
Well on its way. And in terms of hubris, the death toll of the Sultana is really hinged upon the hubris of Captain Mason, who vastly overloaded his boat specifically for money, because the U.S. government was paying quite a bit of money per person for him to transit veterans and prisoners of war.
So he was stacking as many people on board as possible. In fact, they were sitting on the roof and everything else.
And when you can do a comparison, you really begin to realize this, because the the official or the legal capacity of the Sultana was 376 passengers and 85 crew.
Right.
By the time that Captain Mason got done getting his payoff, it was not 376 passengers and 85 crew. It was over 2,000
Yeah.
on board. 1,960 former prisoners of war, as well as 22 guards, 85 crew members, and an additional 70 paying passengers.
That was a very crowded boat.
Who, if they'd had any sense, would have bought a ticket on another boat. But the short version was that the Sultana was so drastically overloaded that the weight on the boat, in this case of human cargo, just set the stage for the boiler explosion.
Yeah.
And it was about 7 miles north of Memphis, and in the middle of the night, in April of 1865. And after having numerous issues and delays, they finally get back out on the river, proceed less than 10 miles north of Memphis, and light up the sky when the Sultana spontaneously combusts.
Yeah. And I mean, this very, very heartbreaking, very tragic, and very much an illustration of the dangerous side of riverboat travel during the 1800s. The risks were something that I think modern sensibilities would be aghast at.
Yes.
I think the only thing that is reminiscent is the current debate over driverless vehicles, and whether or not we are to a point that it makes sense, and the debate about, do you use AI, do you use radar, and what's reliable, and that unpredictability that has been demonstrated in certain cases is just a glimpse of what was happening on a regular basis with riverboat travel.
Yes, and out of in that just a few moments, comparatively speaking, in April 27th of 1865, the death toll was 1,169.
And really amazingly that it wasn't even more, to be honest.
It is it is there was I'm trying to remember the plaque that I was reading. It was when I was in Soulard. But one of the and of course Soulard is a good distance from the river.
Yeah.
Comparatively speaking. I mean, mile or so.
Yeah. Probably mile and a quarter. Yeah.
There's a discussion point. It was a historical discussion point, but a strong push to make sure that the structures as far away as Soulard were built of brick and stone, so that they were less likely to be damaged or caught on fire by the steamboats.
It just gives an indication of how far shrapnel would go.
And I don't remember the name of the boat, but I mean, it was notable. And it's something that isn't conveyed in the photos, because you just, you see these crowded riverboat ports. And the riverboat port, I mean, the landing space is still there with a lot of old cobble stone brick and the whole bit. I walked on it a couple of weeks ago, originally with hundreds of steamboats in port at any given time. And of course, just like on the high seas, certain ships would have certain ports of call. It's their port, that's their base, their destination base. And number of periphery, Ozarks periphery or Ozark cities, Herman had a number of steamboats that would originate from Herman and then return. And I wouldn't be surprised if Osceola did as well, although I don't have that documentation. And and St. Louis was the port, along with Memphis and New Orleans. But the fact that it was very possible for, in the midst of this unbelievably crowded space, on the edge of this booming metropolis, that one of these magnificent steamboats with all of its Victorian filigree could build up steam, load up, back 20 or 30 yards into the river and spontaneously explode, immediately set fire to 6 or 7 steamboats next to it, and hurl shrapnel half a mile into the city.
Yeah.
Occasionally
What's that? You could be walking down the street and hit by shrapnel.
Be decapitated by a chunk of steamboat.
Yeah.
And obviously it was regarded as a tragedy, but the fact that there wasn't a social uproar over the occurrence, but more the fact that this was the price of doing business.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is kind of lost in the chatter these days, is that the amount of risk that was accepted as, this is tragic and I hope it doesn't, obviously no one wanted it to happen or happen to them, but accepting that you were going to have a level of chaos and loss for progress at a level that would be unimaginable today.
It would. And there was certainly it reminds me of certain farming experiences for me, and some of my family members going, there's no way that's gonna hold when we take it down the road, and then other family members going, it'll be fine. And I typically just experience these extremely mixed emotions. And on one hand, extraordinarily relieved that, for example, we didn't lose half of our hay load on the highway, and another half just being irritated that taking the most foolhardy choice available would oftentimes, the reward for that was, oh, see, it worked, it's fine, it's not a problem.
Yeah. And often that is the attitude that happens until it doesn't work.
And sometimes when it doesn't work, it really doesn't work.
That's true. It works very unwell.
Oh, amid grand cursing and gnashing of teeth and dragging bales of hay out of the middle of the highway before somebody runs into them, is a bit of there's no life like farm life.
No, there's not.
As a associate, I'm going to pivot a little bit. For us, it's first document the cumulative
Okay.
notes on page 13, Legends of the Ozarks, digging a little bit into our somewhat, pardon me, somewhat hazy lore dealing with, of course, first of all, what was referred to as the country of the six bulls.
Yes.
And it's a reference to the rivers.
Yeah.
And I find it really uniquely fascinating. There's a sort of a language corruption that takes place. and there's some contradiction on, because the six bulls, we see this very, very early in the almost pre-settlement era of the Ozarks, pre-white settlement, that there's specifically Edmund Jennings going into the Ozarks interior and going native, and the trapper and pioneer Gideon Sims. And these guys going into the Ozarks Highland interior before there was any white people there. And it's also important to note this was ancestral Osage hunting land, but in many cases the Osage weren't living in the land. They would nomadically hunt into the space and then return to their winter camps along the Osage River, which is, interestingly enough, essentially around Osceola.
Right.
And so certainly a wildness to the land in, say, 1800, 1790 to 1810, an incredible wildness to the land, and an untouched wilderness to such a large degree. And for European, the European mindset, European settler mindset coming into the space, the fact that you could traverse for months under certain circumstances and never even run into anyone.
Yeah.
Really gave the impression, it wasn't a correct impression, but it was a very valid impression, that nobody was in the land.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be like showing up at a shopping mall on the one day a week that it's closed.
Yes. And they was open for business. That's my Blazing Saddles quote for the evening.
I walked into that one.
What's that?
I walked into that one.
Well, it is one of our favorite films. So
Definitely.
Mel Brooks is one of my heroes.
Mine too.
But there is at least one reference that, and I just find this fascinating, because these early settler trappers come out and they've essentially gone native. They have interacted with First Nation peoples. They come out, and they're these stories that get passed around of the country of the six bulls.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be a dialect corruption, meaning the country of the six boils, meaning the water boiling out of the ground, specifically springs or rapids. And at least one reference says that those six tributaries, we're back to the river, the six tributaries being Cowskin Indian Creek, Shoal Creek, Spring River, North Fork, being included in those.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking at
and I think the other two are Center Creek and Elk River, but
yeah. Now there's another somewhat contradictory note, different documentation that throws the White River into it. And of course, once you do that, you're moving into a completely different part of the Ozarks. So gets, there's some question on that, but looking at this, the tie that I'm making is this very unique nomenclature about the tributaries and the waters. Associating the tributaries and waters is very important with the First Nation people who were in those regions. And then specifically tying that to the Native Americans around Neosho, and this association, fire, water, elements, of the great fire spirit, and this story that each new moon, which will be here in 2 weeks, each new moon, right before State of the Ozarks Fest. Very happy about that. I think we're moving into a waxing moon for the festival. So happy. The Indians sent delegations with flesh and corn offerings to the fire spirit, due north from Neosho for a night and a day, to a spring that was a writhing column of fire. And is understood as a naturally occurring burning jet of natural gas, and that this was directly associated, obviously, with ritual and a great deal of importance associated with this particular group, which appear to be Osage. We're talking about the Neosho area, and I still think that one ridge is filled with watchers, but that's just me.
Yeah, and if it's a day and a night walk, it to be honest, it would probably be close to Shoal Creek, would be my guess. That would put it not. My guess, roughly in the Saginaw or South Joplin area. Oh, right along Shoal Creek would be my guess.
Yeah. It's there's something deeply resonating about this story, and of course, associating that with, first of all, the springs, the rivers, the tributaries that we have, but then also, so we have all this water, but then also fire. Yeah.
And there are tales of fire spirits with First Nations people in the southern Ozarks, but this is really the only fire spirit story that I know of this far north in the Ozarks.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump off on one of my tangents, because there, and there's this initial aspect that I tend to dislike, which is a recurring theme, and I'm not arguing with the physics of the reality. Was it a natural gas? I'm not arguing with that. But there is this overtly intellectual, let's say European intellectualism, post-colonialism, that comes along, and it certainly is heavily leveraged off of American industry, and is heavily leveraged off of the what I classify as a New World narrative, beginning with the Columbia Exposition, the St. Louis World's Fair, etc. That really attempts to highlight the industrialized people with their knowledge of natural gas, as opposed to the primitive peoples who don't understand natural gas, or apparently how to exploit it, and pipe it across long distances, and use it for my stove, which do like, but that's not my point. Because the innate, there's a direct implication in stories like this that say, we've, with our industry and technology and our intellectual prowess, we've come in and we've decoded the mystery.
Right.
Essentially, we've solved the mystery. As much as I love Scooby-Doo, it pains me to make this comparison. We pulled the mask off the monster. We found out that you're just a, embezzling librarian, whatever. And the world can go back into its proper place where we live in our suburbs, we watch our TV, nothing really goes bump in the night. And there's, for example, no such thing as water spirits, no such thing as fire spirits. We have natural gas for our stoves, we have tap water to drink. Everything has been tamed, everything has been demystified, everything has been disenchanted. And suddenly we're living in a very safe and predictable, but also very small world.
Yeah, antiseptic.
Very antiseptic, very controlled, very childproof kept. And I think that's, I'm certainly, as an individual who appreciates the benefits of current industry and society, and I'd be hypocritical to say, oh, let's just get rid of that and go live off the nuts and berries and what game I could shoot, because I starved to death in a couple of weeks. So that would be awkward. But it at the same time, I prefer to live in a world in which there is a much grander cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
And I will posit as a possibility that when that particular dialect group of Osage in the Neosho area were going to the fire spirit, that they were engaging in a larger cosmology and perhaps even a sentience in cosmology that had meaning and grandeur that is beyond our rather small living in our little suburban dollhouse boxes.
Well, I mean, I think that they did go back repeatedly is evidence of that. Otherwise, they would have just built a campfire.
Right. And I really, and I could be completely wrong about this, but again, these largely colonial, post-colonial tales of the primitive peoples being frightened by technology, or the primitive peoples being frightened by a natural phenomenon that then gets explained by the colonialist is irritating to me at best. And there's a certain, I think a certain kinship, because the larger, I think the larger argument is that we're seeing industrialist versus shamanism.
Yeah.
Because it's, as evidenced of, Great Britain versus Western Ireland, et cetera, is just a singular comparison point. Or if you want to be early modern, modern era versus shamanism, the Roman Catholic Church's, attack on Scandinavian shamanism as well, and vilification of those traditions. That there's larger narratives at work, and I'm jumping all over the place, but I think it's one of the reasons that the Scots-Irish had a tendency to get along as well with the Cherokee as they did, because there were similarities, and in one of the similarities was being united against a larger quote unquote modern era industrialism.
Yeah. Yeah. Similar socio-political pressures.
Yes. And again, coming back to the things traversing on the waters, these are the same these are the same larger narratives that certainly by the 1920s had decided that the most terrifying thing in the world was voodoo. So let's paint it in ridiculous colors and ridiculous patterns, and honestly get people just bent out of shape about how scared they were of it.
Mm-hmm.
Which, one of the things I appreciate about voodoo is it's very practical, and so there are points that if you're doing something stupid, you probably should be afraid of it, but not in this exaggerated sort of ridiculous 1920s 1930s film sense.
Agreed. And that in that line of thought, it's interesting that in some ways it has sort of nullified some of our awareness of the influences that we've talked about tonight with the rivers and water, etc. But again, they continue to flow under the surface and influence things.
They do, over and over, and oftentimes in ways that we just aren't even aware.
Yes, or that just kind of bubble to the surface at different times, pun intended.
Agreed.
That might be a fairly good place to kind of end tonight.
I think for tonight, yes.
Although I think we will have a part 2 on this coming up.
We have pirates left.
Yes, we do.
We'll get to pirates soon.
Yes, we will. And in between, don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we're going to be discussing witchcraft and the Ozarks. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.